Where did we leave Sean Cowboy Hanley?
Sean Cowboy Hanley, to this stage, is still in the background, and then he gets caught with 3 kilos of methamphetamine in Mount in County Laois.
Meth.
Yeah, and this was a strange one because there was another character I remember involved in a similar plot, and they were basically dealing with UVF people, or a loyalist paramilitary gang, like from whatever the other side of the border. So, again, you have this kind of mix and match of different criminal elements from England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, all working together, making
meth
money.
That has caught my eye. That's very early, 2008. We don't see a huge amount of
methamphetamine. No, yeah, I suppose, yeah. It is unusual, but yeah, I mean, that's wherever there's money to be made.
It's wherever there's money, and they're willing to introduce anything. I mean, they don't really care what product goes into the system.
And sometimes it's like a market tester and see how it goes, and it might be, the market wasn't ready for it in 2008.
Shows an ambition as well, doesn't it? Mark Maloney is shot in the April of 2008.
Yeah, and again, like this is outside a shop in Garryowen, and again, it was it was one of these ones. This is a guy who was totally marginal. He was like an easy target, but it led to another killing. There was a young man, James Cronin, and he was found dead 2 days later on waste ground in Ballinacurra, Weston. And the theory was that he was basically dug his own grave, and they shot him because they were worried he had a bit of a. I think they felt that he had kind of broken down a bit after the murder of Maloney, and he had an involvement in that at some level.
It's only 2 days later, so they're obviously afraid he's going to talk. The
McCarthy Dundons were worried that he was going to spill the beans if the guards got to him, so they shot him as a preventative measure.
So they got him to dig his own grave and shot him, and I mean, again, it's all very public, isn't it? Anyone who knows Ballinacurra Weston, the waste ground, Ballinacurra Weston is so close to the city centre. It's so close to the train station. It's, really, you come along that main route into the city, along Ballinacurra, if you're coming in that direction. And
like that's the whole point about this feud.
Yeah.
The entire city it's a tight area.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like certain enclaves on different parts of the city, and it's not a big place. Like, if you're trying to avoid potentially dozens and dozens of people from opposing factions.
And like by this stage, there's a problem for the business people in the city. There's a problem for people living in the city, going shopping in the city. This feud is playing out absolutely anywhere, in takeaways, outside shops, in public areas. There's a position that they have to give out the social welfare on different days because they can't have those clashes happening.
There's been kind of like really serious fights in full eye of the public in broad daylight, and there's various people arrested, and small players are brought to court over that. I mean, that in a way is nothing new. So there's all that, and there'd even be kind of, I suppose, unspoken agreements about not crossing certain parts of the city, or certain parts of the city were off limits. Like, we know that. Like from the likes of Joey O'Callaghan talking to you about how the guys in the city centre of Dublin was seen as a kind of a neutral zone that you could go and enjoy your time there. But once you got back to your neighbourhoods, you were fair game again.
You had to bed down. And
don't forget, at this time, like we're talking about 2005, 2006, 2007, Limerick has also become the hotbed of professional rugby. Like, Munster are at their pinnacle of success at the time. They're competing to get the top end of the European cup. Like, there's huge thousands of fans coming from England and from France, on certain weekends during the year to watch big games happening in Thomond Park. Like, so I mean,
the tourism business is growing,
there's a
and
parallel life going on at the same time. Like, so while you are talking about like the people who are living there in certain parts of the city are living, under this cloud of this constant background noise of intimidation and, whatever else is going on, like the stuff that doesn't even, wouldn't reach our ears, probably, may reach the ears of the guards or whatever. People don't even bother telling each other about it. So that's all going on, like, in a kind of a dull hum in the background, like, And
like what would later happen in Drogheda when the feud breaks out, like, it's bad for business, it's bad for tourism, it's bad for all those things that keeps the city alive and kind of developing. And you're going to have chambers of commerce and investors and stuff being put off coming into the area because of this kind of publicity. The cops always say to you that the criminals need to be lucky every day. They only need to be lucky once. And such is the case here with Liam Keane in Mays, caught with a Glock and ammo. Liam Keane being the son of Christy Keane. He gets ultimately 8-year sentence. Another kind of significant individual.
So this time he's caught red-handed by the guards.
Yeah.
Like, I think there was a car chase and I think there's an armed unit involved and the car was rammed and he was caught, banged to rights. So there was no need for witnesses in this case. So there was no witnesses to intimidate. It was simply a successful operation by the guards.
And 2008 is surely marked by that horrendous killing in the November of innocent Shane Gagan, a rugby player who's killed by the Dundons in a case of mistaken identity. Now, at this point, firstly, the Crumlin-Drimnagh feud is ongoing. You have the activities of the Kinahans out in Spain ramping up, and they are becoming a global force on the drug scene. And they're involved in in-house cleaning as well as, fights with rivals. In particular, I think Paddy Doyle, who is a hitman working with Freddie Thompson and, basically hired out by that Kinahan faction as such, has murdered a number of people in Dublin. He's gone out to Spain really because he has to get out of Ireland, and he's bedded down in Spain. He's living out there. But he seems to ultimately, annoy Daniel Kinahan essentially, and he's shot dead out in Spain. Freddie Thompson and Gary Hutch are with him when that shooting occurs, and they return to sort of sympathise with the parents, but ultimately it will unravel that it is a Kinahan-sanctioned hit on one of their own. But in the meantime, his brother, Barry Doyle, devastated by the murder of Paddy, goes down into the arms of the Dundon gang. He is seeking what? Friendship, community, and they pump him with drugs and everything else.
Yeah, who knows? And we've since found out that he was actually staying in a property that belonged to Ross Browning,
right,
at the time in Limerick, and this came up in that cab case against Browning and his family members, and whatever it was 2-3 years ago now.
It's one of those houses on the High Road.
Yeah. So again, it just shows you that there's no way you had bought that house on the High Road without there was some deal going on or some chit chat with the Dundons. Anyway, Barry Doyle ends up staying in one of these at one point. But Shane Gagan, this is unfortunately where I mentioned, the parallel world of the tourists and the rugby fans coming in. This is where, unfortunately, the underworld and the real world, or the normal world, collide. Shane Gagan is going home to his house. I think Ireland were playing that day, and he'd watch it in his friend's house, and he was going home at 1 a.m, texted the girlfriend, say he was on the way home. The guy, he was a rugby enthusiast, played thirds rugby for Gary Owen or seconds rugby. He was captain of one of the teams, ordinary, decent man. He had a beard, unfortunately, and so did one of his neighbours, which is Johnny Pitchfork McNamara. And that's who the Dundons desperately wanted to kill. He was seen as he's kind of a close affiliate of the Collopys, and they wanted to get at him, and they thought they had him. And
so they sent Barry Doyle out to kill him.
Now we don't find this out for another 4 years, because there's a whole beginning of the wheel starts to really turn against the Dundons, and we haven't got that far yet. There was a lot of there was huge outcry. I mean, this is this is beyond, I suppose, the pale. I mean, Lee Ryan is shot in the leg. You have Brian Fitzgerald is shot dead before that. But now you have just a random person is shot dead totally by mistake. And there's protests against it. This has really made national headlines. In February, then the following February, so this happens in November. The following February, Christy Keane gets out of prison. So now you're kind of thinking, is the tide, is it now in favour of the gangs again? Of course, then you have the weirdest thing happens in March that year. Philip Collopy, the hard man among the King Collopy gang, shoots himself in the head. He's showing off his 9mm Glock to a group of people, forgets that there's a bullet in the breech, and shoots himself.
In the middle of a party?
And now, and it turns out then that Philip Collopy had been talking to the guards about the Shane Gagan murder, that he knew who was behind it.
Okay.
And he claims that John Dundon had actually came to him and sought permission to carry it out. And he thought even Philip Colley people thought this was a bit bizarre.
To seek permission, though, to carry out the Pitchfork McNamara murder as opposed to the Shane Gagan, because he's the mistaken identity. So, but there is a rising tide of outrage against the Limerick gangs. I think the government are beginning to realise that this is so out of control. This is lawless. Limerick is really in need of dire help, and there is a sense of they're going to have to throw money at this and resources at this. But 2009 and April, businessman Roy Collins Jr. is shot. We'll go into the bit of detail of this, but the tide has turned for the Limerick gangs. The nation is outraged. We've had the murder the previous November of innocent Shane Gagan, a rugby player, in a case of mistaken identity. Some years previous, Brian Fitzgerald, a bouncer, has stood up to them and said they're not dealing drugs in his club, and he's shot dead. And Ryan Lee is also a guy working in a bar, actually a cousin, I think, of Roy Collins Jr. He has refused to allow Annabelle Dundon drink in the pub, the family pub, and he's shot twice in the leg. But this murder of the businessman Roy Collins Jr. is really the moment the tide turns.
Yeah, it was a callous murder. There's a guy running a business, with his father, had gone to the casino, kind of an amusement arcade in Roxborough. I'd often driven by it. There's a kind of a McDonald's there as well. There's always plenty of traffic. It's quite close to a motorway exit, so there's sure plenty of people who be visiting Limerick would be aware of the area. You turn left before it and go down and take a right, and you're up through Ballinacurra West and into the train station. And yeah, he was shot dead, and it was purely seen as a really nasty, just personal revenge on the part of Wayne Dundon. He was immediately...
He's still annoyed about the sister not being served?
Yeah. That's what it's down to. He's been harassing Roy Collins Sr., his father, for all this time. They went through, horrendous ordeal, over the intimidation case, which Wayne Dunn got his 5.5 years for. So this is all about kind of, this is about him, getting revenge for that.
Mm-hmm. So protest marches begin in Limerick as a result of this murder of Roy Collins Jr. and the intimidation of his father, Steve Collins, and obviously that shooting of Steve Collins' nephew, Ryan Lee. People take to the streets, which is something we don't see too often. Everybody knows Wayne Dundon has carried out this killing, or certainly directed it with others. But obviously the Gardaí need evidence. And in the meantime, ordinary people of the city are up in arms.
Yeah, there was protests organised by Roy Collins' father, Stephen, and people wore red. And I remember it was a huge crowd. There was thousands at it. There was genuine sympathy for the Collins. There was for the Collins family. There was absolute outrage, at the idea that criminals were continuing to kind of besmirch the city and to kind of create this atmosphere where they felt that they could get away with murder, even from behind bars. It was just, it was a real kind of challenge to the state, and it was becoming a political issue. And it's not long after this that there was new gangland legislation brought in that directing a criminal organisation became a specific offence. And we haven't seen that used so much, but it's still in the toolbox that can be used, and hadn't been there before. And I think there was a willingness, there was kind of, I think, plans being put in place. But more importantly, I think the weight of, I suppose, the emotional pressure that was being brought to bear by ordinary people. There was splits going to start in the gang or in the wider group, that people were fed up with the Dundons. Don't forget, while they're in prison, they don't sit still. They whatever jail they're transferred to, they will try and control the supply of drugs in that case. So you have people who are essentially being held hostage while they're in prison because they're scared stiff of the Dundons. So there's even, I don't know if you remember, there was a picture, we did a story about a guy, and one of the Dundons is sitting beside a guy, and they've kind of jokingly shaved a bit of his hair off, and they drew rings around his nipples with a marker and wrote something across his face and all the rest. And it was all seen as a joke. that was a message.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Think what we can do to this guy inside.
And how scary,
And there was threats of people being violated with broom handles and all sorts of, horrific kind of, sexual violence being threatened with by people connected to the Dundon gang. So all of a sudden,
and all the while they had taken over that Hyde Road, because the three brothers had houses sort of almost side by side. They had burnt out their neighbours. They had, because they didn't want somebody attached to their own home, they had taken over, cocooned essentially houses along the road. I remember going down, it was maybe a few years later than this, when they were actually jailed and people began to start talking about it. But there was families living in the area, Ballinacurra Weston, who said that they literally just knocked on their doors, could be in the morning. They'd open the door, Wayne Dundon might shove past you, go upstairs and drag your child down the stairs, like, a teenage boy or whatever, down the stairs, and hand them a gun and get them to do something. People were terrified of them. So they had really sort of, while people were terrified, I suppose there was a sense of hope that something was going to change and that there would be a crackdown on them. So they were losing support from the ground up. What was the game plan of the Gardaí at this stage? Did they send in the ERU and everything heavy-handed at this point?
Well, he got out of prison in April 2010.
Yeah.
This is for the previous case of intimidation.
Wayne Dundon, yeah.
Wayne Dundon, yeah. So you had Roy Collins was shot dead like in April 2009, and then the chief suspect the following April in 2010 is now released, and that's when, if you remember, we saw the photographs taken at the time of, the guards in their tactical gear. When these guys came out of the house, they were being searched, and it was a full-on in-your-face. Everything they were doing, they were constantly being watched, which was necessary because, as you say, there was kids being pulled out of their houses and being told to carry out serious criminal acts. And the pressure, it wasn't just on the Dundons, it was on other members, like people like Jimmy Collins, no relation to the murdered Roy Collins or his father, Stephen Collins, completely different people. And his daughter, of course, April Collins, who was married to one of the Dundons.
Yes, so April Collins was married to Ger Dundon, or certainly had children with him. Her father, Jimmy Collins, was a kind of an enforcer for the Dundons, wasn't he? And they sort of fall out. The Collinses and the Dundons fall out because April, of course, splits up with Ger, and she goes on to have another relationship, but that relationship ends, and Jimmy Collins and his wife Alice Collins start to separate really from the Dundons.
Yeah, I mean they're making statements to the guards at this stage, and Wayne Dundon makes threats to kill Jimmy and Alice. Threatens to harm, Gareth and April. John Dundon as well, the following year, is also eventually going to be charged with making threats. So this is all happening around 2010, 2011, after he's been released from prison. I mean, they're still investigating the murder of Roy Collins Jr., but the serious pressure is on the guards now. And the Collins, April Collins and her father, Jimmy Collins, they've been chipped away from the McCarthy Dundons, and they're talking to the guards,
which is extraordinary in a way.
It is, yeah, and it's not just April; it's her sister Lisa as well.
Yeah, and they're living down the road on Hyde Road as well.
And they give evidence about listening to Wayne Dundon on the phone, like giving orders. They also give evidence in the Brian Fitzgerald murder as well, and they talk about John Dundon, making. Giving orders and telling people what to do. This
is by February 2012 when Barry Doyle pleads guilty to the Geoghegan murder. So is there evidence heard at that?
Not at that stage because he's pleading guilty. Now don't forget,
but in the background he understands that the Collinses are prepared to give statements that I don't know, Barry Doyle, has he any remorse? He does on arrest.
Well, there's this. I forget now, but there was messages, text messages between him and his then girlfriend and stuff like that were all used in evidence, and you kind of
didn't he give a guard?
There's a little
set of rosary beads or something religious that he'd got from his brother, and he wanted to give it to the Geoghegan family. He seemed to have, at that point anyway, under arrest, felt some remorse for what had happened.
There was a road to the Damascus moment. which I suppose a lot of these guys at some point may feel, and could well be genuine in his case. I mean,
well, you can get over it as well, because I think he has gone into the prison system and been caught up again in gangs within the prison system.
And there was a case of I think, he was told to do this. Like there wasn't a huge amount of choice, I guess, from his point of view at that point. But having said that, there's always a choice.
Yep.
When it comes to taking someone's life. But even while this is going on, like to go back to the start of 2010. There's a man called Daniel Tracy. He's Christy Keane's nephew. Again, a completely innocent person. He's shot dead as he's making the delivery to a shop. And the guy who's eventually done for that is a guy called John Coughlin, who is the brother of the manslaughter victim Darren Coughlin, if you remember, who was kicked to death a few years previously, for which Richard Chasey and Joe Keane were sentenced for. So basically, you had somebody. A case of mistaken identity years previously, Darren Coughlin being kicked to death, and then in revenge for that, you have another completely innocent person being shot dead. Yeah, and I remember we went down and we went down to take some pictures at that funeral to see whether other gangland figures going to turn up, and Christy Keane was there, and he took exception to some of the media that were there and kind of hushed them away. Now he didn't spot myself and Liam in our van, and I remember we took pictures of various people, but. None of them were criminals. It just shows you that Daniel Tracy was genuinely not involved. I think Niall did a story the year later, like kind of the year anniversary, and it very much looked like, as we watched, that Christy Keane was more or less told you're not welcome at the memorial a year later, right? And was basically given his marching orders that that he was, I suppose, blamed in one sense for Daniel Tracy's death. He was in turn blaming the media for him not being welcome at the funeral, obviously. Yeah. So I mean, that's again, I suppose the point there is that you still have this violence going on, and it's still innocent people that are paying the price for all this mad bloodthirst that's going on, and in some case, like Darren Coughlin's brother, I think there was evidence given that he was quite unstable at the time and all the rest of it, and he went to look to kill another man, Patrick Keane, another brother of Christy Keane, again not a person involved in crime, someone who worked, I think, for the city corporation for years. So right, probably an easy target. Yeah, he would have been, and I think was lucky not to have been found on the day as well by this gunman who would have probably killed him as well. The focus is really on getting Wayne and John Dundon behind bars. They are seen as the game plan for the Gardaí. They need to get them off the street into prison. They realise they're in control of a lot of this violence. They're directing it, whether they're in prison or out. But still, there's murders to happen. And in the September of 2012, just after Barry Doyle pleads guilty to the Geoghegan murder, a 22-year-old Robert Sheehan from Moyross in Limerick is shot attending a wedding reception in Bunratty in Clare. Now, one of the top tourist spots of that region. Yeah. Bunratty brings the rich Americans and various others to the area and is probably a huge source of economy and jobs, on a basic level. Yeah. And this is not necessarily a feud-related murder, but right. It's stemming from that criminality that is thought to be in revenge for a previous attack in which a man was stabbed in the neck. So, as you say, it's this kind of corrosive... This culture of violence is seeping into everywhere. By 2013 now, April Collins is before the courts as a star witness. Yeah, and Wayne and John Dundon are also back behind bars again. So, Wayne Dundon had, a short sojourn out of prison, during which, if you remember, Niall managed to ring the hotel in Mexico where he was holidaying. Where he was holidaying, and I don't think he had a lot to say, but he did actually at the time. Our colleague Alan English, the editor of the outgoing editor of the Sunday Independent, he was the editor in the Limerick Leader at the time, and an irate Wayne Dundon walked in after they had carried pictures of his daughter's communion celebrations in an ornate glass carriage and all the rest and dress, and he Alan obviously managed to calm him down a bit, but he gave this kind of self-serving interview saying this is all untrue, and and again I think he said something similar to Niall as well. He was a good guy, really. He was a good guy, really. Oh yeah, and he was a family man, and he didn't want his daughter in the paper, and he had nothing to do with all this, but kept but did talk about Roy Collins, like, and Steve Collins, and, and like, why are they after me all the time? Like, what's it got to do with me? And, there was a kind of a sense of hurt, like, coming across, which, he doesn't deserve to feel.
Well, the
like,
narcissist, that's classic kind of behavior of a dangerous narcissist, But she's before the court and she's giving evidence that she heard, firstly, John Dundon order Barry Doyle to kill a gang rival. And that was just before Shane Gagan was killed. And her evidence convicts John Dundon and he gets a life sentence in 2013. The following year, in the May of 2014, his brother Wayne Dundon goes on trial for the murder of Roy Collins. Now, what's key in that trial? I covered a bit of that. The evidence was actually from also people in prison, relatives of his, didn't?
Yeah. There was one of the McCarthys. I think Christopher McCarthy gave evidence along with April and Lisa Collins as well. And it was more or less
that he was overheard on the phone.
It was more or less similar evidence again. That and there was other, I think, corroborative evidence as well given in the case, but it was successful in the end, And I mean, there was an attempt to kind of spin it a bit from the other side. If you remember, we had John Dundon's wife or partner, Ciara Killeen, sorry. Yeah, turned up in the office, and was looking to kind of put forward their point of view.
That was Ciara Lynch, who was Desi Dundon's partner. Bizarrely, they met in prison and haven't, I think, spent a day together.
That's right.
Because he's been on life sentence, obviously. Does the violence sort of come to its end after Wayne Dundon and John Dundon are jailed?
Well, don't forget they've already been in jail before they got these life sentences. But but in the meantime, like you've had things like a car bomb exploded under Cowboy Hanley's car in Offaly, like in 2013. I mean, and you had there was Stephen Dougie Moran, who's a Limerick man, who is believed to have had a hand in some of the stuff that was going on, and the likes of us wouldn't have heard of him at this stage. And he was killed in a very professional-looking hit where he was living in Lucan.
Yeah, I had heard of him because he was involved in the Continuity IRA. I'd heard of him through a case I had covered in relation to a guy called Dave Mooney, who was, had clubs in town and was threatened by the Continuity IRA and charged extortion money. And he had come across or certainly heard of Moran. But Moran was also knocking around at this point with John Gilligan, who'd been released from prison and was under threat himself.
Yeah.
And he actually goes into the protection of the Dundon McCarthy mob in the UK after Moran is shot, because he becomes very feared that he's going to, and he has of course survived a gun attack himself, quite a serious one. But he goes into the protection of the Dundons, even though Wayne and John are jailed and Desi's jailed, all three brothers now doing life. Ger Dundon is in and out of prison, but he's largely out and based around the UK. And they do provide this service, and I presume they get quite a lot of take-up from it and work in prison, where they will offer a protection for somebody who is under threat, and they move an individual around holding sites in the UK where they can.
And presumably they'll
protect it.
Also sell you to the highest bidder if they get a better offer.
I thought so, yeah.
As we know.
I certainly wouldn't be trusting them, but so anyway, it does sort of peter out somewhat. Now, Nathan Killeen, who is the brother of the aforementioned Ciara Killeen, a brother-in-law of John Dundon, he's also jailed along with Wayne Dundon for the shooting of Roy Collins Jr.
Yeah.
He
found hiding in the attic, chased by the guards,
Wayne Dundon, of course, is in prison when Roy Collins is shot. He's directed or is convicted because he's directed, but Nathan Killeen is the guy who carries it out.
Yeah, and John Dillon is believed to be the trigger man, and
Killeen the getaway.
Killeen the getaway as well. So again, I mean, John Dillon, very young man, who was basically, I think, was in a place where he was going to be killed if he didn't do it, quite possibly, So
who's left sort of by 2017 when there is beginnings of an operation to tackle money laundering? Because all the drugs money that has gone on over this period of time has gone somewhere. It's been laundered through, in specifically the car industry. But who's left Christy Keane. Is he the guy left standing?
Well, Christy Keane is left standing, and he's lucky to be standing because, in 2015, he was shot 4 times in June that year. And that's kind of, we're probably mistaken in this, but that's kind of seen as the last kind of, outright kind of feud. Related attempted murder. Red Larry McCarthy is later convicted of a role in that he supplied the car to the unknown gun people who carried it out. So he's kind of charged with facilitating a criminal organization. But that doesn't happen for a few years. But yeah, it looks like Christy Keane is very much kind of the last man standing. But then, of course, Wayne Dundon, Nathan Killeen, they lose their appeal in 2017. Like I was saying, Operation Glacier has started, which is really tackling the money laundering, and that's specifically Bourne Motors. And we know from the subsequent cab case then about both sides were working with each other all along.
So they were friends when it came to the money, which is just extraordinary. Yeah. I suppose, to bringing it up to what's happening nowadays, Fat John and Eds McCarthy kind of emerged as the new leaders of that Dundon McCarthy gang, the leftovers of it. And Eds McCarthy in particular takes himself off to Birmingham, where we discover him in the company of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh and co, and becomes very friendly with them. His brother Fat John was released from prison in recent years, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, he's Fat John's been in and out a couple of times. But I mean, Ed's is, as we know now, is a real key player. I mean, the NCA, the National Crime Agency in the UK, we know are looking at him. This is, stuff that we've published in the Sunday World. He's
gone international.
He's gone international, and he was close to Bomber Kavanagh, as you're saying, in Birmingham. So I mean, he's not small time.
Ger Dundon, the final of the Dundon brothers, who hasn't got a life sentence and still hasn't, he gets caught up in a kidnap plot along with Cornelius Price from the Drogheda feud. One side, Cornelius Price and Owen Maguire would have teamed up together in that horrendous Drogheda feud that played out. But he is basically found in the company of Cornelius Price and ultimately gets a 15-year sentence for a kidnap plot in the UK. Of course, he had been arrested at the time of Robbie Lawler's death, along with Levi Killeen, John Dundon's son, and another guy called Quincy Bramble. They were arrested within hours of Robbie Lawler's murder, and they were released without charge. And ongoing is the investigation to untangle exactly what happened there. One way or another, what we do know is that the Dundons were involved in some form of a double cross when it came to that murder. They were caught following their release. 2 female associates of the gang were caught picking up a bounty of 50,000, which had been...
Yeah, Desi Dundon's wife, Ciara Lynch. She eventually gets a prison sentence for that 50 grand handover. She collects that within days of Robbie Lawler's murder.
The PSNI are very adamant that the Dundons had nothing to do with the actual murder. The Gardaí believe they certainly collected a bounty for it, suggesting that they double-crossed the Maguires, essentially their own very complex murder plot.
Kind of head spinning of the Dundons, at their best. And I mean,
and funny, this one will come out exactly what happened, and many players are going to be caught up in this ultimately because of when that Robbie Lawler hit happened in Belfast, April 2020, just as the police of Europe went live on the EncroChat phone network. So the plot to kill Robbie Lawler lies within those countless messages of EncroChat, no doubt to be produced during some of the forthcoming trials in the north. And I think we're going to get a really interesting and frightening snapshot into gangland and what goes on and how everybody is, connected in some way. But bringing it on, I suppose, to now, where are we, or who is at play in Limerick? And Limerick is obviously quieting down. I'm sure the people of Limerick don't like recalling those terrible days when all those feuds were going on. But there's not so much violence. It's like as if the gangs have become more businesslike down there.
Well, that was, I suppose, the lesson, or certainly the point I took from the whole Bourne Motors case, was that, there was an attempt to kind of, just concentrate on the money and, forget about this personal animosities, and those who couldn't, shouldn't be involved. And I mean, I think, some of the some of the evidence or some of the stuff that came out about Red Larry when he was, obsessed with trying to, exact revenge for the insult of Brian Fitzgerald not letting him into the club. There was a sense that, Chaser O'Brien was saying, look, trying to get him out of there and just concentrate on business and forget about this, but he couldn't leave it alone. So there was an element of some of these guys just couldn't, leave the grudges alone, and that money wasn't the important thing, which, to the business-minded people was just hard for them to fathom, I'd say. I mean, he got 6.5 years in the Special Criminal Court in July 24.
Yeah.
I mean, it was talking about him having had a road to the Damascus moment, that he turned over a new leaf. We heard some very positive stuff about his family members and their kind of career path, and what they're doing now, and they and being productive members of society, and having nothing to do with criminality and having got out of Limerick. So I mean, it's not a predestined future for a lot of these people. I mean, we might say, well, poverty and lack of opportunity has forced people to take this route or left them with no choice. But for many people, there can be a choice, and there are some supports out there, probably nowhere near enough. But I mean, there is a kind of a potential for redemption out there. I mean, it certainly doesn't look.
And what about for the Dundons? I mean, John Dundon has appealed. He's lost his appeal. Wayne Dundon, John Dundon still remain a force behind bars and prisons, still constantly looking for opportunities to get involved in direct criminality. Yeah,
I mean, 2018, they were I think John and Wayne were up in Portlaoise Circuit for possession of phones, and and it was just a carry-on with them. They were being smart to the judge. There was, I mean, there was always this kind of messing going on. I mean, John Dundon at the murder trial, firing his legal team, turning up half naked. There was constant kind of anarchy or some kind of attempt at causing chaos to delay things. And they're still at that.
And what about Desi Dundon? Is he coming near the end of his sentence?
Well, I mean, Judge Carney said as soon as if the feud continues, these guys have to stay in prison, and none of them are out. There are two of them, I think, were moved to an open prison. They could walk out any time. Desi isn't one of them. We know that Frog Eye Stanners died in prison. He was found unresponsive in his cell in Mountjoy in 2003. So one of those five guys, died in prison. So he never got to see the light of day, so to speak.
2023. Yeah.
2023. Yeah. And then, now, don't forget then, in the last 2 years now, there's almost been a little uptick in some of this kind of feud-style violence going on, and a lot of it targeted at April Collins and her new partner, Thomas O'Neill. He's been involved in drug dealing. And of course, some people haven't forgotten that, April O'Neill was a state witness. And there's people who can never going to be able to forgive that.
Right. Well, look, that was an incredible history of what went on in Limerick, and interesting to go back and, remember the bad times, I suppose, because things have somewhat calmed down. Obviously, nobody.
Commentators curse now when you say that.
Well, nobody can take an eye off a ball, though, can they? Because that was one of the lessons learned, that you have to react to the small things that happen so as they don't become big things, and try and get in there and negotiate and mediate and do whatever it is you can.
Yeah, well, don't forget some of the so-called shadowy players we were talking about, and others are still there. And
they are, and they're in the estates,
international drug stealing,
and they're still in some of those estates that were, subject to a huge amount of investment by the state. Like in Limerick, they pulled down houses, didn't they, as part of a rejuvenation program, and put money into certain community projects. I've no doubt they're screaming for more money, and they're not, properly funded, because the community services really never are.
No, I mean, there could never be possibly enough money put into stuff like that. I mean, it's always going to need more. And as you say, it can't. Now is not the time to ignore it when you think things are quiet. Now is the time, to go after every small kind of act of intimidation and try to keep a lid on things as best you can, and steer people whichever direction away from that. Whether it means steering them into prison or steering them into a different life of somehow. That's what needs to be done.
Well, Eamon Dillon, thank you very much.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.